Elliot Grayson was just an ordinary guy living in a quiet, poor town called Pine Hollow, Ohio. He worked as a journalist for the local paper, the Pine Hollow Gazette, but his stories were never anything big. They were about things like local events, broken sidewalks, or bake sales. He wasn't famous, and most people didn't even notice him. As a kid, Elliot was quiet and shy. He grew up in a small, run-down house with just his mom, who worked long hours at a diner to keep food on the table. His dad left before Elliot could remember him. With no siblings or close friends, Elliot spent a lot of time by himself. Instead of playing outside, he loved reading old newspapers at the library. He liked how reporters could tell stories that made people think or even change the world. By the time Elliot was 10, he had a big dream. He wanted to be a reporter. Not just any reporter, but someone who uncovered secrets and told stories that mattered. He pictured himself working for big newspapers, writing articles that everyone would talk about. But people around him didn't believe in his dream. His teachers said he should focus on something more realistic. His classmates teased him for being quiet and weird. Even his mom told him it was better to find a safe, steady job. Still, Elliot didn't give up. He went to a small community college and studied journalism. After graduating, he got a job at the Gazette. At first he was excited, but soon he realized the job wasn't what he dreamed of. There were no big stories, no mysteries to solve. Just small-town news that didn't make much of a difference. Over time, people at work started calling him Mouse, because he was so quiet and seemed to blend into the background. Bank robberies had become an unexpected cultural phenomenon in the media. News channels and YouTube videos about these events racked up millions of views. Titles like "The Most Daring Bank Robberies Ever Caught on Camera" and "Genius Heist Plans That Fooled Everyone" flooded recommendation feeds. People were captivated by the mix of danger, clever planning, and the audacity of the criminals. Elliot, feeling invisible in his small-town bubble, couldn't stop watching these videos. He saw how reporters who covered these events became overnight sensations, talking heads on news networks, trending faces on social media, and the narrators of stories that everyone wanted to hear. The robbers themselves often became infamous, with their acts dissected like they were characters in a movie. Elliot realized the power of a single shocking event to catapult someone into the public eye. He began to think, what if I staged a robbery? Not just any robbery, but one so audacious it would dominate the news cycle. The timing had to be perfect. It couldn't be a regular day. It needed to be a day that already carried weight and emotion. That's when the idea came. Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve was sacred and universal. The shock of a bank robbery on such a day, when people were celebrating joy, family, and giving, would make it unforgettable. People wouldn't just talk about the robbery, they'd be obsessed with it. And Elliot, as a journalist, could embed himself in the story, covering the event as if he were just another reporter uncovering the mystery. It was the perfect way to ensure his name was on everyone's lips, first as a brilliant reporter, then as the mastermind behind it all. It was bold. It was risky, but for someone who had spent his whole life being overlooked, it was the only plan that made sense. Elliot knew he couldn't pull off the Christmas Eve robbery alone. He needed a crew, but not just any crew. People as invisible and overlooked as himself. People who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He started looking around Pine Hollow, a town full of quiet desperation, for individuals who might share his frustrations. That's how he found Sarah Mills, Mark Taylor, and Jimmy Alvarez. Sarah, known as Sparrow among the locals, had once been a promising musician. She had dreams of performing on Broadway, but a car accident left her with a limp, derailing her career before it even began. Now she spent her days busking on the streets, playing her violin for spare change. Elliot approached her during one of her performances. He didn't talk about the robbery at first. Instead, he complimented her music and asked about her life. When he finally pitched his idea, he framed it not as a crime, but as a statement. "Imagine how many people will notice you," he said. "Your performance will be the centerpiece of something everyone will talk about. You'll finally have an audience that sees you. Mark Taylor, a former delivery driver, had been let go when his company automated its fleet. He worked part-time at a gas station now, barely making enough to care for his sick mother. Elliot found him during one of his late-night shifts and started a conversation about how unfair the world could be. Over time, Elliot revealed his plan, carefully framing it as a way to help Mark get the money he desperately needed for his mother's medical bills. "No one's going to get hurt," Elliot assured him. "You'd just be the one driving us out of there. It's the easiest job, but without you, none of this works." Jimmy Alvarez was a tech genius whose life had spiraled downward after his father's business failed. Forced to drop out of college to support his family, he now repaired phones in a dingy little shop, his talents wasted on minor fixes. Elliot walked into the shop pretending to need a repair, but what he really wanted was Jimmy's attention. They started talking about technology and hacking, and Elliot eventually steered the conversation toward the plan. "This isn't just about money," Elliot told him. "It's about proving what you're capable of. If anyone can make this work, it's you." Elliot approached each of them individually, tailoring his pitch to their specific struggles and dreams. He emphasized that this wasn't about greed. It was about being seen, about showing the world that the forgotten and overlooked could do something extraordinary. He promised that no one would get hurt, and that if anything went wrong, he would take the blame. His passion and detailed planning eventually won them over. They saw him not just as a leader, but as someone who understood their pain and gave them a purpose. As the weeks passed, the group started working on the plan. Sarah organized a pop-up Christmas performance in front of the bank, a spectacle designed to attract a crowd and distract anyone from noticing what was happening inside. She rallied other local performers, pitching it as a last-minute holiday celebration. On Christmas Eve, there would be singing, Santa costumes, and even fake snow, courtesy of Jimmy, who rigged a snow machine to add to the festive atmosphere. While Sarah performed outside, Elliot would enter the bank dressed as Santa Claus, blending in with the holiday spirit. Jimmy's tech skills would temporarily disable the bank's alarm system, giving Elliot a small window to access the vault. Mark would wait nearby in a van, ready to drive them all to safety once the job was done. The chaos and joy of the performance outside would mask their movements, making it difficult for anyone to notice or react in time. Christmas Eve arrived like a calm before a storm, the kind of stillness that made Pine Hollow feel like a snow globe frozen in time. The streets glistened under soft snowfall, and families bustled around with last-minute shopping. It was the perfect setting for Elliot's plan, a scene of serenity waiting to be shattered. The crew had spent weeks preparing for this night. Sarah, dressed in a long red coat and a Santa hat, had rallied a small group of local performers. They were setting up just outside the Pine Hollow Bank, where the foot traffic was heaviest. A violinist played carols, a couple of singers harmonized Silent Night, and a cheerful crowd began to gather. Sarah, with her commanding stage presence, had turned the distraction into a small spectacle. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was sleepy and relaxed. Only 2 tellers and a security guard were working, their faces bored and eager to finish their shifts. The bank wasn't expecting much business, but the few customers inside had been drawn in by the Christmas spirit, or the need to cash their last-minute checks. No one paid much attention when a man in a Santa suit stepped inside, lugging a large sack over his shoulder. Elliot moved with purpose. He tipped his hat to the tellers, grinning like a jolly saint. Nick, while surveying the room with sharp eyes. The sack he carried wasn't filled with toys. It contained a carefully packed toolkit, courtesy of Jimmy, who had outfitted him with everything he needed to get into the vault. As Sarah's music swelled outside, Elliot made his move. He approached the counter with a warm, practiced tone. "Merry Christmas," he said, sliding a note across the glass. The teller, a young woman with a nervous smile, unfolded the note and froze. "This is a robbery. Stay calm, and no one gets hurt. Open the vault, and act like nothing's wrong." The woman's eyes darted to the security guard, but Elliot gave a slight shake of his head, his hand hovering just inside his coat, where the unmistakable outline of a weapon pressed. It wasn't real, a replica, but it looked convincing enough to freeze her in place. The security guard was distracted by the growing noise outside. Sarah's performance had reached its peak, with fake snow falling from Jimmy's machine and children laughing as they chased it. Mark's van was parked just around the corner, engine running, ready for a quick getaway. The teller stammered as she led Elliot toward the back. The other teller kept the remaining customers calm, though they were starting to sense that something wasn't right. As Elliot reached the vault, Jimmy's handiwork came into play. The alarm system had been remotely disabled, giving Elliot exactly 3 minutes to get in and out before the backup systems kicked in. Inside the vault, Elliot moved quickly, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. He filled his sack with stacks of cash, just enough to make it seem like a serious heist, but not enough to cripple the small-town bank. He wasn't in this for the money, after all. This was about creating a spectacle, a story so big it would be impossible to ignore. But as he turned to leave, a voice crackled over the guard's radio. "Alarm malfunction detected," it said. The guard's expression shifted from bored to alert in an instant. He turned toward the vault, his hand on his holster just as Elliot stepped out. "Stop right there," the guard barked, drawing his weapon. The tension in the room spiked, and Elliot's mind raced. This wasn't part of the plan. Thinking fast, Elliot dropped the sack and raised his hands. "Don't shoot," he said, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at him. He gestured toward the crowd outside. "You really want to start shooting with all those people out there?" The guard hesitated, glancing toward the window. The sight of children playing in the fake snow and families gathered around the performance gave him pause. Elliot took the opportunity to move, slipping out of the guard's line of sight and bolting for the exit. Outside, the chaos of the performance worked to Elliot's advantage. The crowd had grown, their cheers and laughter masking the commotion inside the bank. Elliot blended seamlessly into the festive scene, his Santa suit helping him disappear into the sea of red and white. He darted toward Mark's van, the sack of cash slung over his shoulder, and climbed in as Mark floored the gas pedal. Behind them, the first sirens began to wail. The robbery had worked, messier than planned, but it worked. As the van sped away into the snowy night, Elliot glanced at the sack and then back at his crew. The adrenaline was electric, but so was the realization. They had just made history. Pine Hollow's quiet Christmas Eve was over, and Elliot Grayson was finally at the center of the story. As the van sped away, Elliot glanced back through the frost-covered rear window. What he saw nearly made him laugh out loud despite the tension gripping his chest. In the chaos, police officers had descended on the scene outside the bank, but instead of pursuing him, they were detaining the wrong people. The Santa performers Sarah had hired as part of the distraction, locals she'd paid a few bucks to hand out candy canes and spread holiday cheer, were being forced to the ground, their bags of candy mistaken for loot. One particularly bewildered man, still holding a box of chocolate coins, was shouting, "I'm just here for the kids," as an officer wrestled him into cuffs. Elliot couldn't help but marvel at the perfection of the diversion. The mix of fake Santas and the festive atmosphere had turned the scene into a spectacle of confusion. It was almost too good to be true. As the van disappeared down the snowy street, blending into the quiet outskirts of town, Elliot felt a rush of triumph. The story he had orchestrated was already unfolding, and he knew this moment would be talked about for years. As the van sped through the snowy streets, Elliot knew the second phase of his plan had to start immediately. This wasn't just about the robbery. It was about creating his moment as a reporter, the one that would catapult him into the spotlight. He turned to Mark, who glanced at him with confusion as they neared the outskirts of town. "Stop the van here," Elliot said urgently. Mark hesitated but slammed the brakes near a quiet alley. Without another word, Elliot grabbed a duffel bag he'd stashed earlier and jumped out into the cold night. "I'll meet you later," he said before slamming the door and disappearing into the shadows. Inside the bag was everything he needed for his transformation. Ducking behind a dumpster to avoid being seen, Elliot shed the Santa suit, stuffing it deep into the duffel and changed into his reporter attire. A simple coat and scarf, professional enough to pass as someone on the job. He checked his camera equipment, which he had prepped days before, and made sure it was ready for live footage. A few days earlier, Elliot had approached his skeptical editor at the Pine Hollow Gazette with an idea. "Let me do a Christmas Eve story," he'd pleaded. "The town's been so quiet. People want something festive, something real. Give me a chance." The editor had reluctantly agreed, more to get Elliot out of the office than anything else. Now, armed with that pretext, Elliot made his way back to the scene of his own crime. By the time Elliot arrived near the bank, the chaos had reached a fever pitch. Police lights bathed the street in flashing reds and blues, and officers were shouting instructions as they detained the wrong suspects, Sarah's hired Santas. Families who had been enjoying the performance earlier were now gawking at the spectacle, their festive cheer replaced with shock and confusion. It was the perfect storm. Elliot positioned himself just outside the perimeter, where other curious onlookers had gathered. He flipped on his camera and pressed the record button. Holding the microphone steady, he began to narrate, his voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. This is Elliot Grayson, reporting live from the Pine Hollow Bank, where what began as a cheerful Christmas Eve celebration has turned into a shocking and chaotic scene. Witnesses report that a daring robbery took place just moments ago, with police now apprehending several suspects dressed as Santa Claus. Details are still unfolding, but this is a Christmas Eve Pine Hollow won't soon forget. His words were smooth, confident, and perfectly timed. No one questioned why he was there. After all, this was the kind of story any reporter would jump on. Elliot moved closer to the action, capturing footage of the officers cuffing the bewildered Santas. One man yelled, "I didn't rob anyone. I was handing out candy." Elliot zoomed in, catching the scene as if it were an unscripted, candid moment. The performance was flawless. To anyone watching, Elliot was just a quick-thinking journalist who had stumbled onto the story of the year. As the police continued their work, Elliot kept filming, careful to never linger too long or draw attention to himself. Every moment he captured added to the narrative he was crafting, a dramatic tale of a bold heist and the chaos that followed, all through his lens. By the time Elliot returned to the Gazette's office, he had hours of footage and a story so gripping that even his editor couldn't ignore it. "This is incredible," the editor said, wide-eyed as he watched the raw video. "You were there in the middle of it all." Elliot simply nodded, feigning humility. Inside, he knew his plan was working. He wasn't just a journalist covering the news, he was the story, and no one would ever overlook him again. Elliot trudged through the snow, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The crisp night air stung his face, but he hardly noticed. The adrenaline of his flawless execution, both the robbery and the impromptu reporting, still coursed through his veins. He rounded the corner and spotted the van parked in the shadows of an abandoned lot. Mark was leaning against the side, smoking a cigarette, while Sarah and Jimmy waited inside, their faces tense with anticipation. The door slid open and Elliot climbed in, shaking off the cold. He tossed the duffel bag onto the floor between them and grinned. "It worked," he said, his voice triumphant. "The police are busy chasing the Santas, the footage is perfect, and no one suspects a thing." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide. "You actually pulled it off? They think you're just a reporter?" "Hook, line, and sinker," Elliot confirmed, pulling out the camera. "I was right there in the middle of it, recording everything. By tomorrow, this will be the biggest story Pine Hollow's ever seen." Mark let out a low whistle. "And they didn't even come after us. Damn, man, you're a genius." Jimmy, ever the pragmatist, gestured toward the bag. "That's great and all, but how much did we actually get?" Elliot crouched down, unzipped the bag, and started pulling out bundles of cash. The crew watched in stunned silence as the pile grew larger and larger. Finally, they began to count, their breath visible in the cold air as they whispered numbers. 50, 75, 100,000, Sarah murmured, her hands trembling as she stacked the bundles. "We've got over $200,000 here." Mark's eyes widened. "That's more money than I've seen in my entire life." Jimmy chuckled nervously, shaking his head. "And we didn't even take everything, just enough to make it look legit. This is insane." Elliot sat back, the glow of satisfaction on his face. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We've proven it works. The distraction, the timing, the reporting, it's a perfect system, but one story isn't enough to make me famous. If we really want to cement our names, we need to do it again. Bigger. Better." The crew exchanged uncertain glances. Sarah was the first to speak. "You mean more robberies?" Elliot nodded. "Exactly. A series of robberies, each more daring than the last. The media won't be able to ignore it, and I'll be the reporter on the front lines breaking every story, building the legend. By the time we're done, we'll have more money than we know what to do with, and the world will know my name." Mark grinned, the prospect of more money wiping away any doubts. "I'm in. If it worked once, it can work again." Jimmy hesitated for a moment before nodding. "As long as you keep the tech clean and no one gets hurt, I'll do it." Sarah leaned back, her lips curling into a smile. "Well, I've always liked an encore." Elliot looked at each of them, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Then it's settled. Tonight was just the beginning. We're not just robbing banks, we're rewriting the story of who we are." The crew laughed, the tension melting into a shared excitement. Over the next few months, Elliot and his crew executed a series of robberies with precision, each more daring than the last. They perfected their strategy, using Sarah's performances as distractions, Jimmy's tech expertise to disable alarms, and Mark's quick driving for clean getaways. Elliot continued to play dual roles, mastermind and journalist, covering each heist with exclusive up-close footage that made him the talk of the local news circuit. The second robbery targeted a larger bank during a community fundraiser. Sarah organized a charity concert outside, drawing a massive crowd. Inside, Elliot, dressed as a delivery man, slipped into the vault, while Jimmy hacked the systems remotely. They made off with over $300,000, leaving police scrambling. The third heist involved an armored truck. Posing as a film crew shooting a Christmas commercial, they set up fake roadblocks, forcing the truck to reroute. Jimmy jammed its GPS, while Mark intercepted it in a fake courier van. Elliot filmed the scene from a safe distance, later releasing the footage as exclusive coverage of the daring theft. Each robbery fed into Elliot's growing reputation as the journalist with a knack for being at the right place at the right time. Meanwhile, the crew grew bolder, their bond strengthening with every successful heist. The money piled up and so did the stakes. The world was watching, but no one suspected the reporter telling the story was the one orchestrating it all. Elliot sat under the bright lights of a large media conference hall, surrounded by some of the most renowned journalists in the industry. He was the guest of honor, invited to speak about his uncanny ability to cover the Pine Hollow robberies. The room was packed with reporters, editors, and aspiring journalists, all eager to hear from the man who had become a rising star in the field. Applause filled the air as he took the stage, microphone in hand, his heart pounding, not with nerves, but with pride. One by one, the questions came, each more flattering than the last. How do you always manage to be in the right place at the right time? Your storytelling is so vivid and raw. How do you capture these moments so perfectly? Do you think your work will change how crimes are reported? Elliot smiled, giving modest answers about hard work, intuition, and dedication to the truth. Inside, he couldn't help but revel in the irony. They had no idea he wasn't just reporting the story, he was writing it, orchestrating every detail. As the evening wore on, praise after praise was heaped upon him. He should have felt satisfied, but instead, a thought gnawed at him. This isn't enough. If I stop now, I'll fade into the background again. As the applause died down and Elliot stepped off the stage, he made up his mind. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He needed something bigger, something that would shake not just Pine Hollow, but the entire country. The next robbery wouldn't just be another heist. It would be a spectacle unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Later that night, Elliot gathered his crew in the back room of Mark's garage. The tension in the air was thick as they sat around the table, their faces illuminated by the dim overhead light. "I've got an idea," Elliot began, his voice calm but electric with excitement. "We've been doing great, but we're still small time. It's time we go big. I'm talking about something that no one will ever forget." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Bigger than robbing banks? What are you thinking?" Elliot leaned forward, a grin spreading across his face. "We hit the Federal Reserve transport convoy." The room went silent. Even Jimmy, who prided himself on being unflappable, looked stunned. "You're talking about robbing the Federal Reserve's cash truck? The one that moves millions of dollars in a single haul? Are you insane?" "Not insane," Elliot replied, his grin never fading. "Ambitious, think about it. The security, the logistics, the sheer amount of money. It's the ultimate heist. If we pull this off, it won't just be the biggest story in Pine Hollow. It'll be national news. Every channel, every paper, every website will be talking about it, and I'll be right there covering it all." Mark whistled low. "That's bold. But how the hell do we pull something like that off?" Elliot began outlining his plan, his energy infectious. "It's all about timing. The convoy follows a predictable route. We stage a massive distraction. Sarah, you're in charge of that again. Something so big that it forces them to stop. Jimmy, you hack the communications and jam their signals. Mark, you'll intercept their lead vehicle, cutting off their escape. And me? I'll be there, camera rolling, reporting on the chaos while we take what's inside." Sarah crossed her arms, skeptical but intrigued. "And what kind of distraction are we talking about?" "A fake emergency," Elliot said. "Something they can't ignore. Maybe a staged explosion on their route. Something that forces them to slow down and stop, giving us the window we need." The crew exchanged glances, the enormity of the plan sinking in. It was dangerous, risky, and borderline impossible. But it was also thrilling. Sarah finally nodded. "If we're doing this, we do it right, no half measures." Jimmy smirked. "Well, if I'm going down, I might as well go down in history." Mark grinned. "Let's do it. Let's make this the heist they'll talk about for decades." It was early morning, the kind of cold gray dawn where everything felt heavy with anticipation. The Federal Reserve convoy was scheduled to move through Pine Hollow on its routine route to a nearby depository, carrying millions of dollars in cash. Elliot and his crew were already in position, every step of the plan meticulously timed. The convoy consisted of 3 armored trucks and a lead security vehicle. It was heavily guarded, the kind of operation that no ordinary criminal would dare to touch. But Elliot wasn't just any criminal. He was a man with a vision and a plan to execute it flawlessly. The first phase began with Sarah's distraction. She and a group of performers had staged a massive holiday parade on the convoy's expected route. It wasn't unusual for Pine Hollow to host last-minute events, especially during the holiday season, so the parade seemed innocent enough. Sarah led a group of actors, complete with marching bands, floats, and fake protesters waving signs about better roads for the town. It was colorful, noisy, and impossible to ignore. As the convoy approached the parade, the lead security vehicle slowed down, its driver already on edge. "What the hell is this?" one of the guards muttered over the radio. Jimmy, positioned in a nearby van disguised as a telecom repair vehicle, tapped into the convoy's communication systems. He jammed their radios with static, cutting off their ability to coordinate. "They're deaf now," Jimmy said over his own secure line to the crew. "You've got 5 minutes." At the same time, a pre-staged explosion rocked a nearby overpass. It was harmless, just smoke bombs and sound effects rigged by Jimmy, but it looked real enough to force the convoy to stop completely. The guards were now isolated, their route blocked, their radios useless. Panic began to set in. Mark, driving a stolen garbage truck, positioned himself in front of the lead vehicle, effectively trapping the convoy between the parade and the smoke-filled overpass. He jumped out, wearing a reflective vest to blend in with the chaos, and waved his arms like a traffic worker trying to help. Elliot, dressed as a reporter with his camera rolling, approached the scene from the opposite side. His disguise was perfect. He wore a press badge and carried his equipment like any legitimate journalist. "This is Elliot Grayson, live on the scene of a massive incident involving a Federal Reserve convoy," he said into his microphone, his voice steady and professional. As the guards scrambled to assess the situation, 2 more crew members disguised as EMTs rushed toward the armored trucks. The guards hesitated, unsure whether these newcomers were there to help or harm. That brief hesitation was all Elliot's team needed. Jimmy remotely disabled the electronic locks on the rear doors of the armored trucks. With practiced precision, Sarah and another crew member yanked open the doors and began hauling out duffel bags stuffed with cash. The guards, Still disoriented, barely had time to react before smoke grenades deployed near the trucks, further obscuring their vision. Elliot kept filming, narrating the chaos like a seasoned journalist. "What appears to be a coordinated attack is unfolding right now," he said, his voice cutting through the confusion. "The convoy has been stopped, and armed individuals are seizing cash from the trucks." The smoke and noise disoriented not just the guards, but also any potential bystanders. Within minutes, the crew had loaded the stolen money into a separate van parked nearby. Mark, having abandoned the garbage truck, joined them in the getaway vehicle. As the smoke began to clear, the convoy guards finally regained their composure and fired a few warning shots into the air. But by then, the crew was gone, their van speeding through back alleys and onto a pre-planned escape route. Jimmy remotely erased any digital traces of their movements, while Sarah and Mark changed into civilian clothes in the back of the van. Elliot, meanwhile, stayed behind just long enough to finish his coverage. He filmed the aftermath, the guards shouting into their dead radios, the empty trucks, the chaos of the parade still unfolding nearby. Then he disappeared into the crowd, blending in like any other reporter. By the time the crew regrouped in their safe house, the adrenaline was coursing through their veins. The duffel bags were stacked on the table, each one overflowing with cash. Jimmy did a quick count, his hand shaking. This is over $10 million, he whispered. The room fell silent for a moment, the magnitude of what they'd done sinking in. Then Elliot broke into a wide grin. "We did it," he said. "We pulled off the biggest heist this town has ever seen." Mark laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Not just the town. This is national news." Elliot nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "And I'm going to make sure it's told exactly the way we want it. By tomorrow, this will be on every channel, every headline. No one will ever forget this." As the crew celebrated their success, Elliot stood and addressed them, his tone calm but serious. "Listen, this isn't over yet. We've made history, but now we need to be smart. The money can't stay here. Each of you will take a share. Hide it somewhere safe, somewhere only you know. Lay low and I'll handle the fallout." Sarah frowned. "And what about you?" "I'll stay in the spotlight," Elliot explained. "The media's watching me now, and that'll keep the attention off you. Once things cool down, we'll regroup." Reluctantly, the crew agreed. One by one, they packed their shares of the cash and slipped into the night. Before leaving, Mark paused and grinned. "You're insane, Elliot, but it's working. See you when it's safe." As the door closed, Elliot stood alone in the quiet room, the weight of his plans settling in. The world outside was buzzing with the chaos he'd created, and he was ready for the next move. Elliot sat on his worn-out couch, eyes glued to the television as his face filled the screen. The final edit of his report was flawless. Tight. Professional. The kind of work that could win awards. The footage captured every dramatic detail of the convoy heist. The halted trucks, the billowing smoke, the chaos of the parade. His narration was calm and authoritative, the hallmark of a journalist who just happened to be at the center of the action. "This," he thought, "is my masterpiece." The broadcast continued, his voice ringing out. As the convoy approached the overpass, confusion set in among the guards. Reports suggest that they failed to react in time, allowing the assailants to coordinate their escape with precision. He smiled to himself, satisfied. But then, something felt off. The camera cut to a shot of the convoy near the overpass. Elliot squinted at the screen, his chest tightening as he replayed the scene in his mind. His narration had perfectly aligned with the moment captured on film, but there was one glaring problem. The overpass wasn't visible from where he claimed to be standing. His stomach dropped. He rewound the footage, scanning it again. The camera angles, the timeline, none of it should have been possible based on the vantage point he'd staged during the event. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. How could I have known what happened at the overpass? The mistake was subtle, but devastating. He'd been too confident, too eager to narrate the perfect story, and now it was all coming back to haunt him. No bystander or reporter could have known such specific details unless they had been directly involved in the planning. The room seemed to close in around him as he sat frozen, the weight of his error sinking in. If anyone noticed, and they would sooner or later, the entire illusion would crumble. His fame, his crew's safety, the fortune they'd hidden, it would all be gone. And for the first time, Elliot felt the cold grip of fear tightening around his throat. Elliot realized his mistake might expose him, but he clung to the hope that no one would notice. Yet in the days following the broadcast, subtle cracks began to form. His colleagues at the Gazette started asking him more pointed questions about his reporting. "How do you always seem to get so close to the action?" one asked with a half smile. A local officer brought up the overpass in casual conversation, noting Elliot's description of the explosion and the guards' reactions. Elliot stammered a vague reply, feeling the officer's eyes linger a moment too long. The first real blow came when a rival journalist at a national network aired a piece questioning his uncanny access to every robbery. The reporter dissected Elliot's footage, pointing out how his narration often included details no one else had observed. "How does he know what happened in areas the cameras didn't catch?" the journalist asked, letting the implication hang in the air. It wasn't an accusation, but it was enough to make people suspicious. Elliot felt the pressure mounting. Every unmarked car on his street, every glance from a neighbor, felt like evidence that someone was watching him. His crew began to grow restless too. Sarah was the first to voice her concern. "You said you'd keep us out of this," she snapped during a tense meeting. "Now it feels like your face is everywhere. How long until they start looking at us?" Jimmy tried to calm her, but even he admitted things were getting risky. "We need to lay low. No more heists. This is getting too hot." Elliot, however, refused to back down. He insisted he could keep the narrative under control, but his usual confidence was gone, replaced by thinly veiled panic. Then came the breaking point. A child, barely 8 years old, was interviewed on a local news segment about the parade near the robbery. The boy shyly told the camera that he'd seen something strange. "I saw Santa run behind a truck and take off his hat and beard," he said. "Then he put on a different jacket and had a camera. I thought maybe he was a reporter pretending to be Santa." The anchor chuckled at the story, brushing it off as a child's imagination. But someone in the police department didn't. The police began piecing together witness testimonies. A detained Santa from the first robbery recalled seeing Elliot just minutes after the heist, camera ready. The rival journalist added fuel to the fire, publishing a follow-up expose that highlighted Elliot's suspicious timing at every robbery scene. The FBI started analyzing his footage more closely, finding discrepancies in timestamps and angles. One piece of footage showed Elliot narrating an event that hadn't yet unfolded, something he couldn't explain. The crew felt the walls closing in. Mark was the first to break under police pressure, offering partial information to save himself. "I just drove the van," he said during interrogation. "Elliot's the one who planned it all." That was enough for the authorities to issue a warrant for Elliot's arrest. As Elliot packed to flee, he couldn't resist one last attempt to control the narrative. He set up a live stream, intending to confess in his own way, framing his actions as a misunderstood social experiment. He wanted to claim that the heists were an elaborate statement on society's obsession with fame, that he was simply exposing the flaws in the system. But before he could finish, the door to his apartment burst open. The live stream cut to static as police swarmed the room, dragging him away in handcuffs. The news of Elliot's arrest became a sensation. The world was stunned to learn that the journalist, who had covered the Pine Hollow robberies so masterfully, had been the mastermind behind them all. His crew was rounded up one by one, each cutting deals to reduce their sentences. In the end, Elliot achieved the fame he always craved, but not in the way he imagined. As he sat in his prison cell, the world debated whether he was a villain or a genius. He began writing a memoir, claiming he did it all to reveal the dark truths about fame and spectacle. But the legacy he left behind was one of betrayal and chaos, forever tarnished by the very success he had sought.